If God is everywhere, why do we spend our lives searching for him? The paradox seems simple, yet it defines much of human history. Across cultures and religions, people search for the divine through pilgrimage, scripture, ritual, or emotion, as though God were a distant object waiting to be found. Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Andalusian philosopher-mystic, proposed a radical inversion of this idea. He argued that God cannot be found through distance because he was never absent. The divine is already present as the deepest layer of your own being. For Ibn Arabi, the real quest is not outward but inward, not toward a place but toward a state of recognition. To know God, one must know one's own essence. What we call self-knowledge, when purified of illusion, becomes divine knowledge itself. Modern psychology gives us a language for what Ibn Arabi saw centuries ago: the fragmentation of self in contemporary life. The human mind is continuously overstimulated, toggling between digital notifications, emotional triggers, and social comparisons. Our attention is divided, our sense of identity unstable. Cognitive science calls this chronic attentional fragmentation, a state in which neural energy is scattered across multiple competing stimuli. The result is a weakened sense of coherence, what psychologists term self-concept diffusion. In simpler terms, we know how to function, but not who we are. The modern self is largely constructed, defined by metrics of productivity, appearance, or online validation. Yet beneath this cognitive performance lies an unexamined question. What is the essence that observes all these roles? This disconnection between the observing self and the constructed self leads to existential fatigue, the feeling of living efficiently but meaninglessly. Ibn Arabi diagnosed this condition long before modern science. He described it as confusion between the egoic self, which believes it exists independently, and the essential self, which is the reflection of the divine. His philosophy offers a rational path back to wholeness, the restoration of awareness to its original clarity. Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi was not merely a mystic but a systematic metaphysician. Born in Andalusia and later settled in Damascus, he wrote hundreds of works exploring theology, psychology, and ontology. His influence shaped both Islamic philosophy and later Western thought on consciousness, known as Al-Shaykh, Al-Akbar, the greatest master. His central insight can be summarized in one statement: he who knows himself knows his Lord. This knowledge is not intellectual information, but direct awareness of reality as it truly is. Ibn Arabi's doctrine of the unity of being is often misunderstood as pantheism. In truth, it describes consciousness as a single continuum expressing itself through multiple forms. The human being is not separate from God, but a particular mode through which divine consciousness perceives itself. Understanding. This requires a shift in how we interpret awareness itself, from a private mental phenomenon to a universal function of being. Ibn Arabi often described existence as a mirror. God, the absolute reality, desired to know himself, not because he lacked knowledge, but because knowledge requires manifestation. A mirror reflects what already exists. It does not create it. In this metaphor, the universe is the mirror, and human consciousness is the most polished surface within it. When you become aware of yourself, you are, in essence, participating in God's act of self-knowledge. He wrote, "The eye with which you see God is the same eye with which God sees you." This is not poetic mysticism, but metaphysical precision. Perception is one act, experienced from two sides, Modern researchers define meta-awareness, the mind's ability to observe its own processes, as a recursive loop of cognition. When you notice a thought rather than merely having it, awareness is reflecting upon itself. In Ibn Arabi's language, this is the divine gazing into its own mirror. When the mirror is clouded by ego, by identification with thoughts, status, or fear, the reflection is distorted. When the surface is clear, awareness reveals its true nature. Divine presence without separation. Ibn Arabi identified the main obstacle to realization as the illusion of independent selfhood. The ego imagines itself as a separate entity, a wave mistaking itself for the whole ocean. Modern neuroscience arrives at a similar conclusion. Through the predictive coding model, the brain continuously generates an internal simulation of me to interpret sensory data. This model is adaptive for survival, but fundamentally illusory. It creates the appearance of an observer distinct from the observed. Studies on the default mode network, the brain system associated with self-referential thought, show that when this network quiets, as in deep meditation, subjects report feelings of unity and loss of separateness. The subjective boundary dissolves, revealing what mystics call non-dual awareness. Ibn Arabi would describe this not as merging with God, but as realizing that separation never truly existed. The self was never autonomous. It was always a configuration of divine attributes. Humility, in his view, is not moral modesty, but metaphysical. Accuracy, perceiving the self as a temporary expression of infinite consciousness, another key idea in Ibn Arabi's philosophy, is the distinction between form and meaning. Ordinary perception attaches to forms, material objects, social roles, rituals, doctrines. The enlightened perception sees through these forms to the meanings they express. Every phenomenon becomes a sign pointing back to its source. Philosophically, this suggests that multiplicity is symbolic, a language through which unity communicates with itself. Cognitive linguistics offers a modern analogy. The conceptual metaphor theory, developed by Lakoff and Johnson, explains that human thought operates through symbolic mapping. We understand abstract meaning through concrete representation. Similarly, for Ibn Arabi, the cosmos is a vast metaphor. Every object, emotion, or event is a vehicle of meaning. Therefore, spiritual maturity does not consist of rejecting the world, but of reading it differently, recognizing essence within appearance. The heart becomes an instrument of interpretation, translating diversity into unity. For Ibn Arabi, the intellect is a useful but limited tool. It can categorize and compare, but it cannot grasp essence, because essence transcends differentiation. He described true knowledge as knowing through unknowing. When the analytical mind exhausts its distinctions, another mode of perception awakens, tasted knowledge, the direct experience of unity. This transition is echoed in neuroscience. When the brain's analytical networks become overactive, creativity and insight decline. When they relax, the brain's associative systems integrate dispersed information, producing sudden coherence, the insight effect, in similar fashion. Ibn Arabi's unveiling is not mystical revelation in the dramatic sense, but a shift of cognitive mode. From linear reasoning to integrative awareness, the knower and the known converge. Knowledge ceases to be about something and becomes the act of being itself. Here lies the profound paradox in Ibn Arabi's system. If the self is a mirror reflecting God, who is the true knower, the human or the divine? He resolves this elegantly. There is no second being to know. Knowing is a single act of divine consciousness expressing itself through the human form. When you say, I know myself, it is, in truth, God knowing himself through you. Philosophically, this collapses the duality of subject and object. Consciousness is not in the individual. The individual is a locus of consciousness. Modern theories such as integrated information theory resonate with this view. They propose that consciousness is intrinsic to existence itself, a fundamental property of reality, not a byproduct of neural complexity. Ibn Arabi would agree, consciousness is being recognizing itself through countless modes. Thus, finding God is not a journey toward a distant entity, but the recognition that awareness itself is divine participation in existence. How does such a vast metaphysical insight translate into everyday living? Ibn Arabi's teaching can be understood as a practical framework for psychological integration, observation, without identification, develop. The habit of observing thoughts and emotions without labeling them as mine. You become the witness rather than the content of experience, meaning, awareness. Treat daily experiences as symbolic expressions rather than random occurrences. Small events begin to reveal structural significance. Connecting your inner state with outer reality. Intellectual humility. Recognize the limits of analysis. Allow intuitive cognition to complement reasoning. Balanced thinkers, those who can suspend certainty, demonstrate higher insight and empathy through these practices. Awareness becomes less reactive, more transparent. The psychological outcome is inner stability. The spiritual outcome is perceiving the divine as immediate presence rather than abstract belief. The journey that began with a search ends in a realization. You cannot find what you already are. Ibn Arabi's teaching reveals that the highest form of knowledge is self-knowledge, purified of illusion. When perception is no longer filtered through the ego, reality discloses itself as a seamless manifestation of divine consciousness. This is not mysticism as emotional escape, but metaphysical realism, the recognition that consciousness itself is the field in which the sacred operates. Modern science, too, increasingly acknowledges that the observer and the observed cannot be separated. Reality is participatory. Awareness shapes what it perceives. Thus, to find God is not to add something new to experience, but to remove the distortion that concealed what was always present. The P